Professor Μαζάουερ, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Pleasure.
You've been here for the Καθημερινή conference on the 50 years of the restoration of democracy. Why is this discussion relevant? And what do you think are, this period's greater strengths and success, and what is probably a failure?
Well, I think one of the reasons it's relevant is that, unfortunately, we live in a time where around the world democracy is not taken for granted as the, let's say, natural destination of history. And so to think about Greece's experience, which on the whole I think has been a very positive experience since 1974, is interesting, and also it gives us a sense of optimism, I think, which is in short supply right now.
And if we're talking about the major figures in this period, is it Karamanlis, is it Papandreou? Again, the discussion, strengths and weaknesses?
So one of the striking things that came out of this conference was that there seemed to be, for many people, two camps, and you're either a fan of the one or you're a fan of the other. You can't be a fan of both because they stand for such different things. I tend to think, in a way, the victory of Andreas in 1981 was, in a way, the proof of the genius of Karamanlis, of his achievement. If the Metapolítευσης had not happened, we would remember Karamanlis in a very different way, as a more ambivalent figure from the 1950s and the 1960s who sent himself into exile and was never heard of again. So his historic importance for Greece, to a large extent, rests on what he did after 1974, and we had a very important and interesting discussion of that. But for many people, the proof of the enduring legacy of what he did only came about in the 1980s, when it turned out that PASOK and the left could be a normal part of the political game in Greece for the first time, really, in its history. So I have the luxury of not having to choose. I think that they were both figures of historic importance who incarnated very different aspects of Greek reality.
I know that asking a historian the question "what if" is not valid, is not relevant, but sometimes I think if the Junta didn't take place in this country, and if Papandreou Andreas came to power not in 1981, but maybe in the late 60s, when the whole world was changing, when, in Paris things were happening, in Eastern Europe too, in the United States, of course, with all these movements, whether, Greece would have progressed in a much, swifter and much smoother way, I guess. Is that the way that you actually look at things?
Or perhaps it would not have progressed at all.
Really?
And you had the Americans in the mid-1960s who felt they could more or less run the country, and the main issue for them was whether the CIA was on the same page as the State Department or not. You had the king, and the monarchy for a long time had not really been very sure of where its constitutional limits lay, and was inclined to push at those. And you had an old guard of politicians who had been running the country for 100 years or so. And so it's very hard to imagine Andreas coming to power in those circumstances. They didn't even want his father to come to power. So I think all of that had to go. And one of the consequences of the junta was this radical sweeping away of many of the pillars of power. And so there is a kind of internal battle that goes on after 1967 between the colonels and the king. That means the army and the king are now against one another, which was unprecedented in Greece's history. So there's a strange way in which the junta settles a lot of issues, if I can put it in that very dry way, for Greece, that probably would have been much more difficult to settle in any other way.
An interesting take. Do you recall your first visit to Greece? It must have been somewhere in the early 70s, a much different country, I guess. And what was so charming for a British guy? What was so charming about Greece at that point that made you, delve into the history and fathom into the history of this country?
Well, I first came to Greece in the summer, I think, of 1977, early summer of 77. So I didn't know it at the time, but I now realize this was in the early years of the Μεταπολίτευση. And I fell in love with the country for all the irrational reasons that happen when you fall in love. Actually, I remember it very vividly. And the first thing I remember is waking up on the ferry, coming into Igoumenitsa, and the light and the mountains. And it's a cliche because so many people who are not from Greece have described the same thing, but the impact, if you grew up in North London where it rains all the time, was overwhelming. And the second thing that I remember from that trip is taking the train, the old train, from Patras into Athens, and this slow, small, narrow gauge train where I wouldn't have been surprised if the tachydromos had been throwing the letters out to the villagers as you passed. It was going at that kind of speed. And so I was in a different society from, I'd grown up in London in the 60s and the early 70s, very different kind of place. And there was something about the society of that time that had an instant appeal for me.
And of course the sense of history, so many different layers of history, I guess.
Well, if you're a foreigner, the first thing you're told to see when you go to Greece are the temples and the ancient sites. But I was very lucky in my teachers and in my friends, and I was, by 1981, very conscious. I think it was 1981 that changed this for me, that the country was living through some extraordinary euphoria, some extraordinary period, and that was all about what had happened in the last 5, 10, 30 years. And I started to find the temples less interesting and more boring than the country around me. And so that's when I started to get interested in modern Greece.
There's a famous line that dates back to the 19th century, belonging to a French diplomat who characterized the Greeks as les enfants gâtés de l'histoire, and that's the title of Kostas Kostis' book, I'm sure that you know. My question here is whether you sense that this phrase is not relevant anymore, meaning that after so many years, so many crises, wars, the recent crisis, whether the Greeks are now on the right side of history.
Well, there was a sense in which if you think yourself back to the position of, let's say, 1830, and you're creating a country that has no recent past that you want to remember. All it has is what powerful foreigners tell you it has, which is the ancient past. You exist in this very strange, difficult relationship to your past. And I think that has taken, and that will always be there in a way, except now there are 200 years of history of independent life, and there are many more things for us to argue about than Pericles. And so the situation has changed, and I do think that, to come back to the Μεταπολίτευση, the importance of the Μεταπολίτευση was, as it were, it settled a lot of these questions. Questions about the role of the monarchy, questions about the role of the army, that had been there from the very start, but I believe they're not there today. And now they're there for people like me, for historians who want to go to the archives. But most people, they're not there. So something fundamental did change.
One thing you wrote at the early stages of the Greek crisis, some 10 years ago, it was a piece at the New York Times. You said that Greece, in a way, has been over the last 200 years at the forefront of Europe's evolution. First country to revolt to the Ottomans, first country that the population exchange took place, first country to repel the Germans and the Italians, the Second World War, the first theater of operations in the Cold War, and then the first country to liberate itself in the 1970s from the junta, meaning among the Southern European countries, and then the first one to actually experience what the financial crisis brought in Europe in 2008. Another question here is whether you still look at Greece with a sense of something new that arises that will give us a sense of, a direction to the rest of the world.
So I have two things to say about that, I think. One is that it's always very tempting but slightly dangerous to think that one's own country or oneself
True.
should be the center of attention, is special. We all do it, and we all know the limitations of that. Now I'm going to give you a second very practical answer to your question. If you teach about the history of modern Greece in England or in America, it's a minority interest.
Mm-hmm.
And so naturally you start to find the ways to interest other people in what you're doing. And you explain to them that it isn't always the big states who have the most to teach you about where the world is going. It's somewhere like Greece. And the fact that Greece is a small country, it's very buffeted by history, is in fact the condition of most countries today. And so it becomes your natural inclination to think about the ways in which the country that you work on and you love can illuminate larger problems. So then the question is, how can Greece illuminate the larger problems of the world today? And I still find that to be true. And I mean, I think that there are two that are huge issues facing Greece and facing everybody. And the two that strike me are how we cope with a post-industrial society of very unequal income and increasingly unequal income, and what that does for the kids, what that does for younger generations. I think that's the number one social, long-term social problem. And then how we adjust to the reality of global warming, which is going to have a huge effect all over the Mediterranean, and we can see it already. So I think there are still ways in which, you know, Greece is confronting issues that are going to be with everybody if they're not with them now.
Just to sum up the discussion about the crisis.
Yeah.
At that point, like 10 years ago, did you believe that, did you sense that, you know, we were a mature democracy, that there would be a smooth transition in power between, you know, the right wing and the left wing, Syriza coming to power, a huge financial crisis hitting the country, but the country would actually bounce back at the end? Did you expect that to happen like 10 years ago, or were you worried that, you know, maybe the country could, you know, fall into some kind of an anomaly?
Well, I remember there were some people outside the country who were writing silly things about how we're worried that there might be a coup in Greece. That was never a concern for me. Maybe I was missing something, but I didn't think that was ever a problem. I was worried about the impact on confidence in institutions, because it takes a long time to build up institutions and it's very easy to knock them down. But I think that actually Greece weathered the crisis and the institutions weathered the crisis. And the problems that exist with the institutions are the problems that have existed with them for a long time. So I also think Greece has many things going for it, in particular a very outward-looking view of the world and a very polyglot. It's got a population that's comfortable with foreigners and comfortable with foreign languages. Not many countries have that.
True.
So I was always sanguine about Greece emerging. But at the same time, you could see if you remembered what the country had been like a few years earlier, it was sad and alarming. And it still is worrying, I think, that the longer term problems are there.
Kostas Kostis was the last guest in our show, and he claimed that Μεταπολίτευση ends in 2008, when the period of deglobalization takes place, where more autocratic regimes arise and the world is moving to a darker, less liberal phase. What's your take on the notion that the world is now entering a new phase?
Kostas and I met in 1983, and we've been arguing about history and politics ever since. So I see that that's not going to stop. At the conference, I gave a talk about the Μεταπολίτευση, and I suggested that one of the odd things about this word is its ambiguity. Nobody can decide when it finished, or if it's finished at all. And that therefore the choice that you make about when you're going to say the Μεταπολίτευση finished is generally some part of some larger argument about what's right or wrong with Greece.
All right.
So Kostas picks 2008, and that's his right, and then certain conclusions follow about Greece's problems today.
Moving our discussion into today, do you sense that in politics the scheme left versus right is it relevant or is it now obsolete? And there's a tendency that we look also at this country where the right-wing parties like New Democracy, they're moving towards the center. There's space left for the extreme right, and the left is somehow marginalized.
So I don't think that the terms left and right are by any means obsolete, because they correspond to different kinds of issues in society that you always need to keep in mind. Any successful politician of left or right is always looking to occupy the center ground, and so that's nothing new there. I think what you find in Greece today is that the chief problem is that on the whole the center-right is unified in New Democracy and the center-left is fragmented. And so that obviously weakens the capacity of the left. But I think that there are two overlapping, more or less overlapping visions of what a good society should be. And these are both broad camps, so there is an overlap. But if you were to try and do away with the distinctions entirely and say there's no longer any left and any right, you would be, I worry right now that what you would miss is that sense of where the public sector should play a role in ensuring a kind of fairness for society. And that's what might disappear. So I think they are both needed in our analysis of where we're going.
In less than 100 days we have European elections. Is the rise of the extreme right unavoidable, you think?
The longer term, I think there are going to be periods, and this may be one, where the extreme right does very well for two reasons. One is that we lost sight of some very important achievements of the 70s and 80s that produced a much fairer society than we have now. And the second is migration, and migration on the scale that we are either experiencing it or going to experience it in the next 10 years is going to be a challenge.
Right, but is it more immigration or is it more, the inequalities that, capitalism and, the new technology is bringing into our societies?
It's both of those,
it's both?
But we don't have to choose. It's going to be both. And the successful politics are going to be the ones that find answers to both of those things, I think.
If I were to ask a history professor, what should we change in the way that history is taught, what would you say?
Get the kids into the archives. There are fantastic archives. The great pleasure of history is not reading a boring textbook. That puts most people off. The great pleasure is putting them in touch with the original documents that somebody wrote 100 years ago and letting them have the thrill of discovery. So that's what I would change.
Wow. And what unexplored areas of Greek history would you like to examine in the future?
Well, there are many, I think. I'm quite interested in the history of mental illness, which is still a bit of a taboo. Not much has been written about the history of gay life in Greece, and I'm quite interested. We came out of the Metapolitevsi and there was a great investment in social history, and the history of ordinary people, the history of workers, the history of the left movement, and we lost sight of the history of the rich, the history of the king, actually the powers that ran the country. We don't have so much on them, and I'm interested in that.
So are you giving us a sense of what your upcoming book is?
Well, people never really like talking about their upcoming book, but yes, I'm very interested in that milieu of the megaloastiki taxi that's somehow not with us anymore in the way that it used to be. Where did it go? I'm interested in that. Where did that class go?
All right. Professor Mazzaur, thank you very much for being tonight with us.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much.